The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus departed from there and came to his native place, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished. And they said, "What mighty deeds are wrought by his hands? Is he not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, of Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his native place, and among his own kin, and in his own house." So he was not able to perform any mighty deed there, apart from curing a few sick people and laying hands on them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Second reading comes from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians in chapter 12. And Paul talks a little bit about some of the spiritual transformation that he has undergone. He says that he's been the recipient of many blessings, and he calls that an abundance of revelations, that God has spoken to him and revealed himself to Paul in many different ways. An abundance of revelations that many other Christians at the time did not have. And Paul sees it as blessings, but he also understands that there's an inclination on his part to become proud. Although it's the word elated that he uses 2 times. So that I might not become elated, God does this to me. And so he recognizes he's received blessings, spiritual blessings from God. The temptation is to become proud, to glory in those for himself, to see himself as better than others. So therefore, he understands that God has given him a thorn in the flesh, an angel of Satan to beat him down. And biblical scholars have speculated as to what that thorn in the flesh might be, what that physical suffering of Paul might have been. No clear answers, at least from his letters, on what that might be. But Paul understands that he has some kind of physical suffering in his life, and he sees that as a gift from God. Even though in the beginning he says, "I begged the Lord 3 times, take this away from me, make me better, take away my physical suffering." And 3 times, in essence, the answer of God was no. Ultimately, Paul understands God's answer as no, because my grace is sufficient for you. Power is made perfect through weakness, God's power. So Paul sees his physical suffering as a gift from God, something to keep him from becoming proud, elated, or glorifying himself in some sense. And then Paul concludes by saying that, therefore I am content with weaknesses in my life. I've made my peace with my physical sufferings and the other weaknesses in my life, because when I am weak, then I am strong. So we kind of see Paul's transformation just in a paragraph or so, kind of summing up his 15 or 20 years of life as a Christian, how he has kind of come full circle of being maybe grateful and proudful of his revelations to becoming grateful for his weaknesses, so that he might not become a proud man. I think Paul is a good example of us of at least a couple of things. One is just simply the idea that God's grace is sufficient for you. And I'm not sure that we always believe that God's grace is enough. And understanding God's grace as his life, God's life himself, and that grace that God gives to us. God's grace is sufficient. You don't need perfect physical health. Don't need lots of money in the bank for retirement. You don't need accolades and affirmations from a lot of people. You don't need an abundance of revelations or consolations from God. Because in truth, in reality, in all honesty, God's life, God's grace is sufficient for you and for me. And I'm not sure that we always believe that. It's there way back in our minds, but not something that we consider very often because we think a lot of things are not sufficient for us. And then the second idea, I think, from Paul's letter is simply that power is made perfect in weakness. If you're like me, you have a lot of weaknesses as well. And at some point, to make peace with our weaknesses, That doesn't mean that we don't try to turn them into strengths. It doesn't mean that we're not aware of them. It doesn't mean that we play to our weaknesses and give in to our weaknesses. But to understand that as try as we might, we can do as much as we can, we still have some weaknesses in our lives as human beings, and eventually to make peace with that, to be content. Because we struggle with our weaknesses quite a bit, sometimes putting the blame on God, sometimes on ourselves or others, and we're just very discontent with our lives at times because of our weaknesses. Paul, at the end of this passage from Corinthians, kind of mentions what some of those weaknesses might be. He says insults are one of those. And I'm not sure if insults are very common for us as adults to give or to receive, although it happens from time to time. Much more common for children and for teens to exchange insults back and forth. But there are times maybe when you've been insulted. You or your family or your Catholic faith, our Catholic faith, insulted and put down from time to time. And maybe to be somewhat, to see it as a weakness, in the sense that there's nothing I can do about it. Nothing I can do to change the insults that I receive. Another example that Paul gives of weaknesses are hardships. So anything that's a difficult time for you. Hardships, difficult times in life that come sometimes in cycles. How are you going to pay the bills? How are you going to make this month's mortgage payment? How are you going to be able to afford college for the children? Maybe the hardship of caring for a sick parent while you're still busy and at work yourself. Maybe there's some tough months of stress with the children, some tension in the house because of them, or maybe because of your spouse, or maybe some fighting that goes on. Maybe just the hardship of dryness in the spiritual life, not a lot of spiritual consolation. From time to time, we face different hardships in our lives. It doesn't necessarily go away very quickly. And Paul sees those things as weaknesses as well. Another example he gives of weaknesses is persecutions. So maybe in a sense being looked down upon because of your Catholic faith. Could be that your family doesn't practice your faith with you. Maybe you're the only one. Everyone else stays home. No one else seems to support you in the practice of your faith. And you're the only one who practices the faith. Maybe it's a spouse who undermines what you teach the children about Christ and God and the church. You do something and they seem to undo it all, right? Don't listen to mom, don't listen to dad. It's not that important, whatever it might be. Or maybe it's the adult children who don't do what you taught them to do, right? That you raise them in the faith. Maybe it's a question of co-workers who in some sense persecute you because of your faith. Things that you won't do that are immoral at work. Whatever it might be. There are sometimes you and I are persecuted because of our Catholic faith. And Paul sees those as weaknesses. And then finally, the last example of weaknesses that he gives in his letter, he talks about constraints. So anything that prevents you from doing the good that you want to do. And those could be physical limitations you might have. I just don't have the energy I had before. I'm getting a little bit older. There's more aches and pains. I can't get out. I don't have a car to go where I'd like to go. At times, our body constrains us. There are things that we just cannot do. Could be financial constraints. You'd like to be more generous, but you don't have the financial means to do so. Could be constraints of time, where time is not always yours right now. Belongs more to your spouse or to your children or to your work, whatever it might be. We face constraints in our lives as well. And so Paul sees these weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and constraints as things that he's come to terms with eventually. He's learned to make peace with these things in his life. It's not all as he had planned or as he'd hoped for in his life, but he sees in these weaknesses the power of God shining through. For us, the trick is really to see these weaknesses which God may never change, which you may never overcome in your life, to be content with them eventually. And it's not that you're happy because of them or joyful because of them. It's not that you're faking happiness, but being content in the sense of tolerating and making peace and saying, well, this is who I am, this is the way that it is. It's not ideal for how I'd love it to be, but this is how it is and it's okay. So for us then, see the lessons of God's power shining through our human weakness, and we understand along with Paul that God's grace is sufficient for you.